Good night. Hello and welcome everyone to part 4 of the Quebec Writers Federation series, Black Writers Out Loud. Thanks to QWF, AELAQ, and Read Quebec, and also to Tanya Evanson for convening us and curating the evening. My name is Canisia Lubrin, and I'm pleased to host Kaie Kellough for tonight. Let us begin by acknowledging that the Quebec Writers Federation represents diverse individuals who live and create on traditional territories of many First Peoples. The QWF office is located at Chiage, which is what Kenyon-Kahaga, or the Mohawk, call Montreal. You, no doubt, joining us from wherever you are in the world, are welcome to acknowledge along with us the histories of where we are, an acknowledgement of the ongoing conflicts and contradictions of the global ecosphere. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from elsewhere, as well as white settlers and those people who have come here by force or otherwise as a result of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. These Americas are built on erasure, and we bring these histories with us when we enter any room, and we must bring them into view in the hopes of making a different world. For tonight, the chat is disabled to the general public, but you can use the Q&A function to post questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can later on. Please note that the event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email with a YouTube link within about 5 days of tonight. Kaie Kellough is a novelist, poet, and sound performer. His work emerges at a crossroads of social engagement and formal experiment. From Western Canada, he lives in Montreal and has roots in Guyana, South America. His books include Dominoes at the Crossroads, short fiction, Vehicule 2020, longlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, and recent winner of the QWF Paragraph Hugh McClelland Prize, and Magnetic Equator, poetry from McClelland Stewart, winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize. His novel Accordion, ARP, 2016, was a finalist for the Amazon Walrus Foundation First Novel Award. Kaie's vocal performance, recorded audio, and electronic narrative explore migration and suspension of arrival. Since 2011, he has recreated mixed media compositions with saxophonist and synthesist Jason Sharp. Kaie's work has traveled internationally, notably to festivals in the UK, Australia, Asia, the Caribbean, and continental Europe. He continues to craft new passages. Can you join us on screen?
Hi. Yes, it's nice to be here, and thanks for the introduction. And I'd like to introduce you.
All right.
Okay, so my I guess conversation double today is Canisia Lubrin, who is a writer, critic, editor, and teacher, whose most recent book is the Dyzgrapxst, McClelland Stewart, 2020, as seen in the New York Times, Quill Enquirer, Jewish Currents, Humber Literary Review, and elsewhere. Lubrin's international publications include translations of her work into Spanish, Italian, French, and German. Her writing has been recognized by, among others, the Toronto Book Award, Journey Prize, Gerald Lampert and Pat Lowther Memorial Awards, and the Writers' Trust. Her debut, Voodoo Hypothesis, published by Wolsak Wynn in 2017, made a big sound and was named a CBC Best Book, and her writing has appeared and is forthcoming in Room, Brick, Joyland, Poetry London, Poets.org, blackiris.co, and elsewhere. Lubrin's debut collection of short fiction is forthcoming. She has an MFA from the University of Guelph. And I hope at a certain point tonight I'll be able to ask you about that short fiction. It's always exciting when poets break the mold and move over into the sentence. But before we do that, I'd like to read a passage from your recent book, the Dyzgrapxst, because I love this section in it. There's this kind of dream section where the poems kind of follow the contours of different dreams, and some of the poems are fragmentary in nature, and the rhythm of the section and of the poems themselves is really wonderful. So I'm just gonna string a few of them together. So this starts at dream number 31. Some years are newly sisting, some means to see far long, where I bring the merciless, the mercied, the ones the poet says are certain, not the enemy. I bring a small mud, the empty champagne glass. I bring the unannounced, the aircraft and target. What news I bring brings the knowing, the really happened, the not yet known, the new again, the version in the version that was lost, the version with some years of growth, the non-pill, the no-mo, and through all of this is uncertain, the mo-betta, the lost, the sugar, the lost, the brutal cool of hours south of the border. Here go my failing nondescript pronouncements, the eye and ear and mouth here, with the art that lost life, here a muscle, here a way to lean gently, a movable sense. What this is I have barely been, abridged, I have merely paused, on a return, away or what? Listen, you call me an ambulance or leave me nondescript, leave a sidewalk, or like I said before, just a voice, making music again, brutal, cool, I'll go back again. Is that a return? And when they ask where I've been, I'll have gathered enough miles in the muscle of my tongue to give no answer quite so satisfying as life, you know. But to say I've come back from knotting myself permissive, from leaking enough around my hard edges, from the give this back, I do now wish to strike at it again. This life, you know, all of it is lamped days, to have it all come back sweetly, as thankless time in mileage, making every revolution a raise of Dennery heights. What could you call that? Back to where? Perhaps I've strayed too far from the epicenter. Back to where? Perhaps I've overlooked the constant trough. Blank, or what the fuck was I thinking? If given the barracks, dive in. If given the hand, dig. If given the back, make do, bend. If given the afternoon, keep watch. If given the sun, spare no country. If given the tool, skim I loose. If given the giving, sing wind. If given the voice, say so. If given the mercy, make do. If given us, give us.
Thank you, Kaie, for infusing these poems with your own particular brand of music. To hear them newly is quite a gift. That's a gift. Thank you so much. And so I suppose I'm going to have to read from your book, Magnetic Equator, sort of soul-shaking text, definitely of magnetic proportion. So I will read from 0 degrees. Now that you have lain down in the back seat, the cassette clicks and begins its slow spin. The album Exodus. As the band sings and soars, you sink into the silver upholstery of the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, into the softness of the suburbs, the fuzz of Tylenol and carbon monoxide that bleaches the air in the car. The interior is white, impenetrable with engine exhaust. You think about what you want to write. You want to explain, but then You don't. You want to lash out, scrawl, dismiss life as a decision forced upon you. How do you begin? You close your eyes and think, and the thought drips from your limp fingers. The page. If anyone were to look in the window, they would not see the boy lolling in the back seat. The air is dense, unbreathable, but the body still heaves. Its biology drives it to. This is its will. It shudders as it gulps. The music, the Whalers band rides their upbeat skank, rides their pneumatic bass line through the analog cloud. A mystic song that stalled. Breath can't silence, delivering its message even as a shadow crowds the cranium. A high, hoarse wail piercing the engine's numbing hum, a voice suffused with sorrow and rage, refuting sleep, scorning resignation, singing yourself up and out of the car, out of the darkened garage, and toward the brilliance that explodes into shards and pierces pupils, singing you back into sunlight and leaf.
Thank you. I've never heard anything from that book read back to me, so that was quite incredible. So thanks for putting your music to it.
Appreciate that. What a poem. What a poem that is. Thank you for writing it. And so I wonder if we can begin our provocations for tonight. If I ask you about your experience publishing a first book, how aware were you of the space and place that you were writing into and maybe even from? Or did you have a sense of writerly or artistic risk at all when you began making literature, from like your first book, your first chapbooks to now?
My first book was published when I was in Montreal, and I had been living in Calgary before that. And at that time that book came out, I was much younger. I was kind of naive, and although I had kind of had some interaction with the literary community, I had had a lot more with the music community and the world of literature and performance, the spoken word, dub poetry. Publishing was always something I had been interested in, but one of the things that happens when you're young is, I had started performing at a pretty young age, around 18, 19. And one of the things that made performance so exciting, and I thought of it as a kind of publication, was that back in those days, I don't know if it's the same because I don't even remember the last time I submitted to a literary journal. It's probably been over 20 years. But like, I would, you would submit a poem to a journal. You would read these kind of like irritable and petulant submission guidelines, and then you would submit it seemed kind of discouraging, and maybe they were being so for a reason, but that's how it felt from the I guess the vantage point of being a young writer, young Black writer on the prairies. And so, you would submit your poem, and then it would be the case that it would take about 6 months to get back to you, or 4 months to get back to you with an acceptance or a rejection. And then after that, it would be another 4 or 6 or 8 months before your poem might appear. And for a person who is 19 or 20 years old, to wait 8, 9 months you're a different person by the time the poem appears. You've renounced it. You know, you're no longer in the same space. Your politics have changed, your outlook has changed, you know, but performance was very different. It was so immediate. It wasn't gate kept in the same way. And, you know, it was possible to perform and then immediately start meeting other collaborators, other writers, other people who would encourage one's work. And that's the world that I kind of gravitated toward as a result. And when that first book came out, I was really thinking a lot about how to make, I mean, my main thought in that book was how to make language on the page kind of give the appearance of being sonic and having movement, sonic and dynamic, on a silent and unmoving page. And that was what I was thinking about. And in terms of where it was coming from and where it was going to, you know, I was thinking a lot about, I was pretty fresh from an experience in Calgary, which I've talked about recently as being an experience of a kind of a lack of narrative. You grow up and you are not in official narratives. There are no mixed race or Black boys on the prairies in the official Canadian narratives at that time. We didn't exist. And so my concern at the time was also to just to put some elements of my story and my perceptions of the country I lived in and the world that I was navigating and where I came from and how that informed my perceptions, put that down. You know, that was a long time ago, and that was with a very small press that was very generous with me and no longer exists. Well,
And yeah, and that, you know, that I guess the fact of presses going out of business might be even more acute now with a lot of the announcements that have come in the last couple of weeks, for sure. You know, that this idea of coming from one medium where your entry seems less opaque than what the literary world can present. You know, your books make really dazzling formal experiments, you know, so that there's a kind of meta comment on form in all of them, such that form itself and the comment that the work is making on form become part of the work itself. And I'm thinking of how Accordion reconfigures the footnote and the role of the narrator by interweaving the functions of the two, you know, in the novel. And then how Dominoes at the Crossroads disrupts the usual deployments of the Bildungsroman, the author who shows up in the work, and how, and because form and genre tend to be seen as these really dogmatic, static things, I wonder if you could give a sense of what leads you to the formal risks that you take in your work.
That's a tough question, and I'd like to turn it back to you because I afterward, because in your most recent book there are a lot of formal experiments, especially with the footnote and with some visuality and poetry as well. But I feel that you know, that place of not having a narrative to be part of, really, and also in a place like Calgary, also existing outside of the reach and the routes of the diaspora. That was definitely a sense that I got growing up there. Whereas other places are sung, right? People sing Toronto, people have sung Memphis, people have sung, you know, all kinds of places in North America. But the place where I was from was not a place that was being sung or had been. And although some work by Karina Vernon recently, the Black Prairie Archives anthology, addresses that and speaks to that and shows the work of writers who have talked about life on the prairies. But I was young and I wasn't aware of that. I didn't have access to those kinds of texts at that age. But to address concerns with form, one thing that I can say that always made me feel that I had to experiment with form, well, two things. The first thing is that when it comes to writing fiction and poetry, I'm self-taught. I've never been in done an MFA program or been in workshops. And so I've always felt the sense of urgency, this almost a desperation, where the need to study different forms of art and import techniques that seem to work there into my own writing. And always a worry that I have to be catching up to where my peers who are doing MFA programs or who have, who are teaching in universities and who are read and write partly for a living. I always feel I have to catch up to where they're at. So my senses are always attuned to what's going on in music, in visual arts, and in crafts and in other forms. And I try to abstract the concept and superimpose it on writing and see how it can work there. But also, when I was younger and at the University of Calgary, one of the things that was common at that time was that there was the word political was often deployed as like a way to diminish work by queer writers and writers of color. And it was, well, yeah, we liked the submission. The submission was very good, but it was political. And it was a telling comment and a sort of coded one as well, which meant that that writing didn't deal with the universal themes that literature deals with, like war and love and travel and migration. It looks through the narrow lens of race or sexual orientation or identity, which is another one of those words. Yeah. And I had often thought over many years, I'd often worried, like, why is it that people so often say that my work is about identity or that it's political, and why is this such a problem? Like, is there a way that I should go about not making it those things? Or is there a way that I should embrace those things? And so being young and naive at certain points, I tried to undo those things, tried to make it not about identity. And looked and saw, did I see any traces? Are there any remaining traces of identity in the work? And then as you get older and you realize you can't do that, and how those terms are operating as diminutives or dismissive terms, then I think I was able to move back into the work. But that occasioned, that's kind of soul searching, occasioned a lot of experiments with form and genre. And yeah, so those two approaches were approaches that I took. I wanted to ask you the same question too, though. Where does your sense of, experimentation with form in the Dyzgrapxst, where does that originate? Because the book challenges footnotes. There are some visual experiments in it. And as I had mentioned to you in an email, there are these great moments where, like, I like to call them rogue stanzas. They just sort of pop in the midst of a poem.
Yeah, and it's. I think there might be quite a lot of parallel between what you're saying and my own engagement with experimentation. I actually think all writing is experimental somehow. There's always some level of experimentation happening, even in the most traditional forms of writing. But, just in terms of the actual, at the act of writing itself, I find that I'm always trying to evade boredom. If I go back and do the same thing over and over, I tend to lose interest in the thing that I'm doing. There's a thing that happens for me with monotony and the kind of repetition that doesn't shift, that numbs my capacity to think and to be alive in the thing, And so I think I just have to throw myself these these challenges as I go through the text. But the experiments happening in the Dyzgrapxst are related to just the conceptual framework of the text, and looking at how language is used in these sorts of hegemonic ideas about what makes a self, and to what you're saying about how identity and politics and those phrases are deployed to diminish the work that non-white people do in art. It's not as if, you know, you can separate the work from the world that it's happening in, by virtue of existing in this body, in a post transatlantic slavery world with its continuing frequencies of that history. I am automatically given over to these critiques, I think, and as are we, you know. But the footnotes, I tried to think, what if I turn the footnote upside down? What if the major thing happens in the footnote and not floating above it in the page? With the rogue stanzas, I love that phrase, a rogue stanza. Actually, I might have had that actual word in the Dyzgrapxst maybe way too much, and my editor, Dion, made me take them out. She's like, what's all this rogue stuff happening here? 6 million rogues, you know, what's going on? So it's that that waywardness, you know, that I'm trying to experiment. Much like you, if language does not appear to me as this thin, definite, untroubled thing, and to me, language is full of instability. It's an unstable thing, you know. And so I'm just listening to those sounds and following them into these experiments that hopefully give me a shape that I can make recognizable. You know, that's
yeah. You just opened up a good avenue. I mean, language for me is too. It's full of tension and conflict. It's the battlefield in a sense.
Yeah.
And when it comes to, for me, coming from Western Canada in a particular place and time where we're living in a moment that we shouldn't take for granted right now. We're living in a moment where there's this kind of watershed moment for Black writing in Canada. There's so many young writers who are able to publish their work prominently and to partake of, you know, travel and to have a remarkable platform to present themselves and their work, and to be in conversation with one another. And there's so many different perspectives on our experience across the country right now that are coming forth and being projected into the cultural dialogue. It wasn't like that a long time ago. I mean, we still have a long ways to go, but I feel that one of the urgencies that I was reacting to was trying to figure out, you know, how did I, having this family partly from Guyana, how did they find themselves, of all places, in Calgary? Like, why am I there? What was I doing there? How am I supposed to be in a place like that? And at a certain age where I was writing, I kept wondering, how am I supposed to tell the story of that experience? What vocabulary do I use? Which formal devices am I supposed to use? You know, how am it was very difficult to tell a story directly, because the story would meander and it would digress, it would move through different forms of writing. It was difficult to write, a kind of lyric poem that was in the language that was very current in a lot of lyric poetry in Canada at the time, which was, you know, a smooth and pruned kind of lyric language. I couldn't write like that. Like, I would hear noise and I kept telling myself, well, maybe I just hear language differently, right? Maybe it's turned up to a louder volume, or maybe there's more noise in the mix or something. But it was a different sound and, you know, a different continuum that I was writing in. I really, in that, you know, I really have to say that I've always admired the writers who came from the Caribbean and recognized that, and people like Lillian Allen and Dion, Marlene Norbesi Phillip, and many others who really knew that they couldn't write in that particular kind of Canadian lyric voice.
Yeah.
And they deliberately went to amplify their own specific cultural voices. And I'm grateful for that because that showed the way.
Wonderful. Yeah. And, it's also worth mentioning that, by virtue of being considered outside of the dominant sound, where it's almost, we might take for granted that almost any sound we make outside of that will sound experimental. It will sound bizarre and strange and alien, and so, and it's also very interesting what gets named avant-garde and what doesn't,
Yeah.
right? But that's for another conversation. So if we could shift our gears here a little bit, you tweeted some days ago something about writing a play that takes place entirely within sound. And apart from the intrigue in that, I think it makes a lot of sense given how your work across genres and modes and books and audio publications have sort of happened. There appears to me, at least, a really profound and playful theory of sound or music rippling through all of your works. One gets the sense of an ecosystem of story and language that depends on improvisation as well as pattern. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with Gary Barwin the other day, who's a brilliant poet, novelist, performer, musician, multifaceted, multi-talented, generous individual. And I was kind of explaining to him that my first and most profound, I think, engagement with art was an engagement with the Wailers. In my parents' house. They had all kinds of records around, with different kind of stuff. My mom loved Sam Cooke. I couldn't stand Sam Cooke, but I appreciate Sam Cooke now. I thought that his songs were these tiny sort of, these really precious miracles of compression and melodic sweetness, which they are, and they're beautiful. But I wanted something that was a little rougher. But there's like Mahalia Jackson and Roberta Flack, that record First Take playing, and B.B. King, Jimmy Cliff, Third World. But the Wailers was really an incredible encounter. It was almost like I mean, that's very profound music. It's beautifully recorded. Some of those early Wailers records, Burning, Natty Dread, Exodus. The stories, the lyrics are incredible. There's narrative going through them. There's an appreciation of history. There's a sense of the political urgency of the moment. There's of course, there's the Caribbean language, the Jamaican language in there. There's Queen's English as well. There's that incredible conversation that goes on between Bob and the I3s as they call and respond to each other. And, and the musicianship and the songs are incredible. So I think that every other encounter with art, whether with literature or music or otherwise, is in conversation with that original set of encounters with the Wailers. And that was the most formative artistic experience that I've ever had and probably will ever have, because those early experiences, just the novelty of them can't be duplicated as you get older. But I have always kind of thought of those, that experience of hearing those records as a child as having been inside the music, and that it was, you see a setting appear as the song unfolds. You hear voices, they populate the room, they become characters in this little drama of the song. And so that sense of being inside the song has been kind of with me in, I guess, an inarticulate way until very recently.
That's fascinating, and really the musical quality of your works, I really just can't say enough about. Just really stunning. And maybe it's because I also have that kind of musical brain, and I see the patterns and I see this, how the sounds work within the frames that you put them in. Just quite fascinating. Just now you were saying that maybe you hear noise in the particular registers that you were around when you were younger, especially with the lyric and such. Do you make a distinction between sound and noise? And if you can maybe tell us about noise, what is in it, and how it works as a thing, as a medium in and of itself.
Sure, yeah. I'm the noise. I'm the noise in the mix. I'm the dust on the record, the thing that shouldn't be there in the first place, right? I'm the sound that is supposed to go unheard, and then when it does pipe up, it's too loud, it's in the wrong voice, and so on and so forth, right? That's what when I think of noise, I think of it as perhaps being something unfamiliar, something that is something that doesn't fit sonically, and that there's a quality of difference to it, that it's different from what is either desired or expected. And so that's where I think for me an attraction to noise comes in, is thinking that perhaps I've been an equivalent of noise as a Black person growing up in where I did grow up in a country like this. That was sort of the context in which I started to think of myself potentially at a certain point, of maybe the ideas I had about, that's how I would have thought about it.
That's also very interesting, and I would offer perhaps from where I'm sitting, maybe noise is that conception of noise. It's not so much that you are where you don't belong, but maybe it is the sort of result, the sonic result of being where you are denied, where your existence, your presence is denied, and there's a kind of refusal that makes a certain disturbance.
Yes, I mean that disturbance. It comes up for me in your book, in the Dyzgrapxst. It's almost like in some passages there's a resistance to conveniently making sense, and really a serious resistance to it, like a way of veering around it or leaping over it, and going for a kind of articulation that is difficult and is perhaps noisome. I even noticed with some of the combinations of words. I was reading the passages over earlier today too. I was listening to some old Scatolites and I was reading it to them, and the rhythms lined up nicely, but some words, like I was like, oh geez, some of the combinations of words, they really, the words press up against one another in unusual ways, and there are kind of disruptive almost combination of words. And so I was wondering with you too, I mean, how is noise part of your approach, and how does it find its way in there?
I let noise be, and perhaps noise does not necessarily appear as noise, or it's perceived as noise to me. So I think the word disturbance comes closer than noise, because noise tends to elicit only the oral, and for me it's more than that. It's happening in several senses, and so the disturbance then I think is a more apt characterization of what's happening. And in terms of sense itself and language, the challenge with the Dyzgrapxst was indeed to try to deploy language against the normative, against the comfort of the predictable, and to see what comes from that, because again, it's a book about all the things it's about the self, and it contextualized by the sort of post transatlantic slavery world, capitalism that's just monstrous at its most monstrous proportions, climate disaster. And so you have, if I were to draw from all of these musics and put a language to it that somehow both wills a kind of, you know, angle at something better, while at the same time trying to demonstrate what breaks down. That's the nexus at which I was trying to work at in sound in that book, you know?
You know, the first time I encountered Kamau Brathwaite's writing, just a sec, it was in this anthology.
Oh yeah.
I had a different version of it when I was much younger, and I wore it out. I mean, I took it everywhere with me. It's an old Penguin anthology published in 70s. And I came across, and it has poets from the UK, the Caribbean, the United States, you know, all of your usual suspects. And then some people you wouldn't expect to see, and some poets from Africa as well. Right. It's got poems from people like Sonia Sanchez that you never see anywhere else, right? Like some really intense and furious work from her. And Brathwaite's poems, Kamau's poems in here are anthologized at a time, I guess, under the name L. Edward Brathwaite, not Kamau.
Yeah.
And I remember reading them and starting to read them and thinking that the sound didn't line up for me. Like the rhythm of the poems, the combination of words, the way the lines chopped and broke in certain places, the short lines, and suddenly you'd have all these very short lines and then a longer line, right? Yeah. And at first it didn't make sense to me. Like I was a fairly young reader of poetry at the time. And it took me several times of going back to that. I mean, the book seemed to always open back to his section, right? And each time I went back, it would come a little bit clearer and a little bit clearer. But then one thing I realized when I started to read his work more with a better ear was that he has a tremendous ear for the tremendous ear for rhythmic patterns and even a melodic sensibility, in that he understands the rhythmic patterns, but then the inflections in speech that ride over top those patterns. And he's able to emphasize all of that so that you feel the rhythmic and musical phrase in a line very clearly. He's expert at giving you a clear sense of how that passage should sound. But interestingly, in spite of his precision, it sounded like noise to me at first.
Yeah, that's and again, you know, that's the sort of capacious, creative space that we're working in, you know, as Black peoples. Truly, there's always a kind of illegibility that even we have to come to terms with, you know, because our lives require it, you know. And so that's just a quite wonderful thing. Let us talk a little bit about your fiction. In your story in Dominoes at the Crossroads, the Petit Marronage story, just a really artful rove through the role that colonial laws have played in a particular history, and how that juxtaposes with what is seen as errancy, or that noise, or the illegibility that we're talking about here in Black culture, particularly Black musics, jazz, soca, blues. You bring this into a kind of present day context. And I really love, by the way, how you interrupt time, and your concept of time in that book is stunning. But it makes me think of how freedom is still very much a precarious thing for marginalized people in the early 21st century, sorry. Your narrator says, I'm just gonna quote you here on page 85. "My ear for the cyclic rhythms of Caribbean music challenged my desire for free movement. I came to understand that repetition did not mean stillness or limitation. A reggae rhythm was most dynamic when it was most grounded, most sticky. Subtle variation defined the figures being repeated. How could I integrate flight with repetition, with return? And then later in that story, our protagonist is reluctantly on stage playing in a soca band. And then right at the moment, and he spots a young Black boy being chased through the crowd by cops. Almost by instinct, he begins to play his instrument to a kind of rhythm of escape, a kind of marronage. And so Kamal Brathwaite, which you're just talking about, and he is one of your great influences, and we can see that in your work. He offers a similar idea about reggae as a theory of liberation or resistance. He says, it is the echo, not the rock, that does. It is the reggae rhythm that explodes the prison, burns the clock. What's your sense of how art involves liberation or resistance, particularly in this moment of global Black Lives Matter movements?
You know, I have to say, I love that line, burns the clock.
Yeah.
Because that's a kind of a radical gesture. We're all tethered to the clock, and it burns the urgencies of making capitalism go around and continue. That story was written in a way because I wanted to, there are all kinds of Black artists and musicians who are on tour all the time, right? I mean, I've been on tours around Canada, and one of the things that you notice is that not every city that you go to is Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver necessarily. And so your presence and your appearance in some cities or towns might not be something that people are accustomed to. And seeing that, the Montreal swag or the Toronto attitude in Fredericton or in another city might not be something that people even want to see, or that takes people aback. And I wanted to tell this is really practically speaking, like I wanted to tell a road story, a story of being on the road. And it actually originated as the idea of telling a story about touring while Black. And the narrator was going to be kind of recounting these stories of having been on tour. And then it just shifted and changed as it went along into these moments where the character sort of dips in and out of the present moment back into a time where they might have been enslaved, and this sort of happens as they punctuate their journey across the country. But it also became a narrative of escape, of marronage, flight, return as well, because at a certain point you have to return. You always have to return. You always do return when you're living in the diaspora, or you think about return if you don't return or you can't. But one of the other things that I wanted to try to accomplish with that story was to write about the Black arts and culture presence existing in and touching upon different parts of this country. And I think that that's particularly important in this moment, which is to multiply our narratives and to occupy this place and this culture with those narratives, because we are now, because they exist, because we're here, and because we have a moment where we can really shift the culture and make people think. And so that's, and I've always wanted to live in a culture that values me in the way that I value myself and sees me in the way that I see myself, right? But I never have, right? It's made some there's always, you always have to one way or another compete with white supremacy. It's going to appear. It's going to appear in your Twitter feed. It's going to appear in your reality. It's going to appear all over the place. You still have to deal with that kind of nonsense, and I don't want to live in a culture where I have to have anything to do with that kind of bullshit and people who support that. So my writing is, I guess, part of a tradition that is against that. and that strives toward and makes movements toward some kind of consideration of freedom.
Nice. Wonderful. I just want to remind people that if anybody has any questions, they could use the Q&A function there, and we will try our best to get to those. So a few more questions or provocations. Keeping with the prose, your prose.
Well, I have a question first. Can I ask?
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Because I mean, speaking of narrative, right?
Yeah.
There are narrative currents that run through the Dyzgrapxst, and you have some fiction coming up. So I'm wondering if you were thinking about and writing fiction at the time that you were completing that collection of poems, and how narrative informed that collection.
So the quick answer is I came to poetry later than, I suppose, narrative, prose, or fiction. My my adherence to poetry happened quite late, in other words. And yes, I suppose I have been thinking, I have been writing fiction and prose much longer. But when I'm writing poetry, I don't have anything to do with fiction. It's just, I find it loosens poetry for me, being in a kind of fiction or prose headspace. And so the narrative propulsion that you're seeing in the Dyzgrapxst is it's a necessary kind of evil, I guess. and I say evil lovingly. In that is the one point of coherence that kind of carries the multiplicity of what's happening throughout, right? So just to sort of remind or nod to the goal posts along the way that, this is a kind of life that is growing and evolving through the text, and it's attached to the figure, Jejun, whose narrative stuff is the stickiness throughout, right? So that's kind of it, So let's go back to your fiction quickly. There are some Kaies that appear throughout Dominoes at the Crossroads, and it seems to me that there's an obvious bridge between Accordeon, your first novel, and Dominoes, in such that your MC in Accordeon somehow slips something, lends a kind of narrative hand, let's say, to what's happening in Dominoes. In the last chapter, Anonymous Testimonial 2.00, the narrator says, the soothing voice comes back over the PA. The voice is my voice. It is in my head, and now on my lips, speaking aloud. And then we enter Dominoes at the Crossroads, which is several years apart from Accordeon, with epigraphs from Maryse Condé and Aimé Césaire contextualizing the crossroads. And then the very first story is about confession or testimonial, where we have Marie-Joseph Angélique and her executioner in a kind of narrative proximity. And so clearly you're writing against certain kinds of erasures that exist in the official historical records. And so what can you say about the Caribbean crossroads as a concept that makes the kind of narrative that you are making in Dominoes possible?
There's this problem, which is the problem of having one voice, speak, and having that. I mean, because Accordeon was one of the things that one of the things that I was trying to grapple with in Accordeon, with how does one multiply the voice? Because essentially, if you have a voice, that voice has to come from somewhere. It can't come from everywhere. It can't come from every social register and every social class and every cultural background. even though but I tried to resolve it thinking that the voice in Accordéon might be the voice of the city. But still the voice, in spite of whatever you try to impose on it, it's going to come from the places where you have been and who you are. So it can't be other people's voices and other voices. And that's difficult and it's challenging. And so I wanted to try to find a way to multiply the voices, or at least to give the illusion of a multiplication of voices, but also through doing that, this is in Accordéon, to, pardon me, to ensure that a reader would have a difficult time at different points in the book understanding the narrative hierarchy. Who was the main teller of the story and who that story belonged to and where it came from, right? I wanted that to be confusing. And I was told by an editor during the editing process, some of the richest advice I've ever had to disagree with, which is there has to be a hierarchy among narratives, right? And I thought, oh, yeah. There does, if you want the work to make sense, right? But that's precisely the kind of thing that has to come into being and then immediately has to be deconstructed and contested. Like you can't just let that happen. There can't just be a hierarchy among narratives and there's no insurrection against it, right? That has to happen, right? And I felt that in Dominoes, I was also trying to play with a similar thing. But there's that problem of having one voice and having that hierarchy among narratives. And that's one of the reasons why Kaie appears, and he makes an appearance, and his appearance is described, his background is described, he's kind of denounced, I think, but it's to give the sense that suddenly if the writer appears in the text, well, then he can't be writing it, right? Yeah. And it also kind of undercuts any sense that he might be constructing himself as an authoritative voice on these matters, right? And it identifies him, and it's also a way. I'll say two quick things. One, it was a way of identifying my positionalities artfully. Yeah. Without just coming out and saying, well, as such and such a person from such and such a background, you know, it was a way of doing that and placing that in the text, but in a way that was fun and playful and silly. And in a similar way, there was another thing that I wanted to do in the first story, which is a story about Montreal and its origins, and was a kind of a land acknowledgement, right? And in a way, that story functions as a sort of extended land acknowledgement and a consideration of land acknowledgements, or parts of it function that way.
Wonderful. And you know, it's quite rich to have that sense of the polyvocality of narrative that narrative can have as a kind of crossroads that undermines the hierarchies that we are taught. Well, that narrative needs to function.
Yes, that comes straight out of Maryse Condé, and the quote from Maryse Condé right at the beginning of the book. You know, and in another discussion that I'd had recently, I've had a lot of discussions lately. But there's a passage in an interview in Bomb magazine where she talks about this, where her interviewer asks her what, according to her, makes a story, a Caribbean story. Yeah. And she says that it's that multiplication. She says it's a polyvocality. And voices talking from different positions in the social hierarchy, different types of language, different registers of language. And it's funny because she articulates it so clearly. And I had never really thought of fiction that way, but it would be obvious to think about fiction that way because you can have multiple characters in fiction. But I always thought about the poem that way. The poem is this space where it opens up for all of the hierarchies in language to be flattened or reversed. Yeah. You know?
or in some sense even disappeared, and what's given over is the experience of language itself, which opens up a whole new way of seeing and meaning and being. And so, to think about this again, this polyvocality and what Maryse Godet is offering in relation to your poetry in particular, what's your sense of the Creole Continuum? I'm quoting from one of your poems in there. You have the flocks of vowels and consonants migrating, across. You have that conceit of the magnetic equator, that north-south movement. So what's the Creole Continuum in that for you?
Well, I mean, language moves with people. People are moved by language. And, it's just exciting to think about. What I can say is that some of the most, in Toronto, I'm sure you've seen a lot of really good live poetry events, right? From dub poets to spoken word poets, slam poets. And some of the most amazing performance events I've seen just involve one person and voice, and hearing the way that language was shaped in their mouth with Caribbean inflections through African-American English, through, standard Canadian English, and that movement, and how that shifts the rhythm of language, the meaning of things, and how it can communicate so much without even using the words to say those things that it's saying. And I guess in a way, that's my sense of the Creole Continuum. It's how you inherit languages, even if you don't necessarily speak those languages.
Yeah. Fantastic. So, now might be a good time to take some questions from the audience. And we have one here from Sarah Villa. The question is for Kaie. With regards to the inspirations that derive from the visual arts, have you ever considered a potential future collaboration with Haitian artist Manuel Mathieu in connection with your short story Navette, in which the main character is Haitian?
It seems like I'm being set up for a collaboration. Well, so thank you, Sarah.
So.
But it's funny because I don't really think visually. Right? Like, I'm not a visual thinker. It takes me a long time to come up with visual poems. And one thing I learned actually from your book, from the Dyzgrapxst, is there's, I've wanted to have a kind of conversation with you about this, but it's on page 94. I know this may be hard for people to see, but it's like there's a sine wave traveling through the poem. And it reinforced something that I was aware of about visual poetry, which is that the entire poem doesn't need to be a visual object, right? But it can have qualities of visuality in it. There can be elements things in the poem that you look at while you're actually reading the work. And so I was curious about your approach to that particular poem and to including a kind of visuality in the poem.
Yeah, I mean, much like you, I don't think that I have any intelligible grasp of the visual, particularly with visual art. And I would laugh because I often say that even my stick figures have splinters in them. And it's just not a thing that I'm good at. And if ever, there's some kind of something in it, it's always accidental. And I couldn't tell you how or why, but yeah, it is that what you're saying is that there are multiple dimensions to this, to envisioning and to visualizing, right? And so some of it is languaged, is alphabetized, and others of it is not. And so with that particular poem, I was thinking of doubling the work of meaning in that. And so the actual words in the poem reference a river, just a nondescript river. And then for me, the sine wave was both gesturing to the sound the river makes and the visual shape of the river, right? And so you have those meanings that can be grasped, and it's similar to your what's happening in your visual poems in Magnetic Equator, in Beau and Essequibo, etc., where you have these stretched out and disaggregated I call them words, but you can correct me, with only glimpses of legible letters and phrases in them. And, just very small glimpses. So isn't that what's happening for you?
Yeah, it was actually, those were collaborations with a graphic designer and designer named Kevin Lowe, and Kevin Yuenkit Lowe, who's an old friend and collaborator. And we had sort of taken passages. Those poems, Beau and Essequibo, are actually passages from the book, and they are smeared, I guess, in Photoshop, or stretched or wrenched out of shape, but so that they fit the shapes on a map of the Beau River in Alberta and the Essequibo River in where it splits the South American continent and comes through into Guyana. Yeah.
Beautiful. I keep hearing about the Essequibo River, especially I did a little bit of work with Sandra Brewster, and one of her early exhibitions looked at the river, and how that becomes a kind of archive for family history, etc. Cool. And so another question: was there a particular moment in the leap from poetry to narrative prose that surprised you? Or was it a fluid process for both of us? This is from Adebe Diarango Adem. Hey, Adebe.
Hi, Adebe. This is for both of us?
Yeah. Was there a particular moment in the leap from poetry to narrative prose that surprised you? Or was it a fluid process?
No, it was quite fluid. I mean, the two books were written at the same time, and so they informed each other. They're written kind of together. They're related. They're like siblings, and what happened was that the sentence and fragments of narrative entered the poetry, and what happened in the opposite direction was that the way the poem moves had an impact on the short story. The language of poetry didn't have much of an impact on the way the short stories are the way they sound, the way they read, but it's the movement of the poem. They kind of move and drift. They don't necessarily have to have like a snapping tight narrative arc that's, with a twist at the end and that kind of thing, right? They just kind of meander and drift and curve and then end. And that was what the poem gave to the short story.
Yeah, much the same thing. So I'm not even going to repeat that. Just there's, quite a lot of overlap right there. It's a very similar thing for me. The poet is always present in whatever it is I'm writing. And so it's that movement that you're talking about is precise. So we have one more question here from Rebecca Rustin. And I think I might just bridge the two. I just have one question here that would complement hers or theirs, I don't know, quite nicely. And then you can read for us again. And then I have a really tiny thing before we leave. So the Oxford English dictionaries, they do their word of the year every year. And this year there are dozens of words, which in fact is in keeping with the year we've kind of had. And some of those words include Black Lives Matter, doom scrolling, super spreader, social distancing. A lot of them are portmanteaus, where you jam two words together because sometimes one word just doesn't do it. And so I was actually wondering what the current, this year with COVID-19 and on protests for racial justice and all of that, and the climate catastrophe, what is any of that doing to your work? Do you feel any sense of pressure? And then Rebecca is asking here how to stay motivated and find time to write when in long-term survival mode.
Well, I mean, I can contribute, I think a word that has to enter that lexicon straight out of Quebec is red zone. Now,
Oh,
zone,
yes.
the red zone, it's like the most dramatic sounding zone in Canada.
In the world, I'd say.
But yeah, I always think that when I was younger, I felt like I was reading for my life, right? In a way that I was reading to understand. I wasn't just reading. I was reading to understand who I was and what I was doing and how to survive in this culture. And I don't mean that in terms of to be dramatic. I mean how to survive as a fully realized human being in this culture, right? And not someone whose self-esteem or their perception of themselves in the world was perpetually minimized or damaged, right? And I think that writing that comes out of African America and out of the Caribbean is always a response to the necessities of survival. It's not ornamental, it's not decorative, and it's not something that is unnecessary. It's not dessert, right? You know what I mean?
Oh, no. I was going to say, don't trigger dessert gate. You have all the dessert enthusiasts coming for you on Twitter after this.
So I almost regret saying it, but yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Perfectly sensible. But also it's an unsense. It's a kind of in a way to disrupt what we think about as what's needed just for us to survive, what those accepted scripts are anyway. So maybe we can end with your reading, but let me do this really quick word association thing. I'm going to read you a few lines of poetry, and what's the first thing that comes to mind? Okay, first thought, best thought here. Okay, the silence was the best thing. You're thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking. It's space. It's always good to have some space in the groove. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's from Dion Brand's verse of 41 in the Blue Clerk. Afternoon of a saxophone.
I've had those afternoons. Yeah, I had one really recently with Sonny Rollins' record, East Broadway Rundown. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
You always, I always look forward to your morning listening vibes on Twitter.
Okay.
That's from Brathwaite's Duke. Duke in Middle Passages, Brathwaite. And the last one, or the apprehension of rains.
Yeah. The apprehension of rains. That's awesome. Yeah. That's all I can say about that. Where is that from?
That's great. That's from Zong number 19. Or Bese. Zong, yeah.
I was like, is that Dion? Did Dion say that?
That's from Zong. So why don't you read for us now?
Okay, I'll read a short passage for you. I will read a short passage. "1980. I was 5 in a carpeted bungalow in Vancouver. My mother used to take me to Ambleside Beach at low tide to turn over rocks in search of translucent crabs. Viscous sea moss and wet sand, anemones anchored, the Pacific Ocean cold. 1980 drops into darkness. Outside Georgetown Prison, the car radio playing, song soft over the grumble of internal combustion. Rodney's heart speeding as he glances at shadows, slowing as he settles back into the night's unhurried breath, drone, chirrup, rustle, groan, gurgle rippling in concentric arcs from no center, expanding everywhere, converging on this car parked, on this body, dispersing through the circuit of veins and synapses, nerve impulses, firing through flesh and reverberating back into everything living, frog flitting beneath the dew-darkened leaves, everything living, in rhythm, everything breathing with everything, and then a spark, a rip in the peace of the universe, and blooming fire expanding, blasting the living, blowing car window, shards, to pierce hearts, pierce hopes, wound the future, the bursting spark flare, out against the night and ignite, death and the radio explode the dark, voices scatter like fireflies, like oh bright birds aflame, oh voices flung, oh pain buzzing, stinging the tropical blackness, oh static crack, crick and scatter, sound wave snakes, shock waves verbing, oh screaming through the skeletal moon glow, screaming holes, oh holes blown in the chassis, in the man himself, in the air, in time, in the word love, and the city boomed awake to shuddering, oh burning, oh weeping, oh wailing, oh pressure, oh all time stop. 1980, drop and smoke in columns from the broken, blaze up to cure the moon. Now through this hole in the truth, Radio Demerara firing out and reloading, a bulletin framing this man, this historian, this Rodney of flesh and black and continental afro of Tanzanian memory, behind horn-rimmed spectacles the fashion, bell-bottomed for his own heart's rupture, and a melody drifts along the smoke, but only troops rush in, and another verdant day flares as the radio exports from Buxton on the East Coast to the Church of the Immaculate Conception, the funeral procession. Come, mourners walking on air, footfalls soundless, earth open, broken, ready to receive. A breaker hurls its head against this Vancouver beach, hammering rocks, white foam hissing and scattering up.
Kaie Kellough, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody in between and beyond the next seating. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And let me just remind everyone that the other Black Writers Out Loud events are on the Writers Out Loud section of www.qwf.org. That's www.qwf.org. And thanks again to QWF for producing the event. Tanya, Evanson, all of your fantastic work behind the scenes, and to everyone for coming along with us and sticking with us tonight. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Canisia. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you and to continue our ongoing conversation publicly. So congratulations on your book that recently, well, that came out earlier and this year, and I wish you the best for your fiction. And look forward to reading that too.
Appreciate that so much. We'll be in touch soon, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Brethren, I bow to you. Take care.